this sense of entitlement and superiority that people like, people who belong to my strata of the society. And I think I would like to start from myself. I should ask myself, and I should be asking myself continuously, okay, Muneeb, do you think you would adopt the same tone with someone who is your social equal or someone who is perhaps even more privileged than you? सवाल मेरा ही होना चाहिए, because क्या होता है कभी कभार हम कह देते हैं ना जी मैंने गुस्से में ही कह दिया, मुझे उस वक्त गुस्सा आ गया था तो आई एम सॉरी। गुस्से में क्या मैं उसको इस तरह से एड्रेस कर सकता हूं जो सोशली मेरे से ऊपर है? So whenever I am trying to be, oh, I'm just an erred being, to err is to be human. ये हमेशा whenever I err, why do I err on someone who is poorer than me? Let's ask this question to ourselves. Government को क्यों इतनी देर बाद realize हुआ? इसलिए क्योंकि हमें तो realize हो ही नहीं चुका रहा था अभी तक. Unfortunately, and I am extremely glad कि वकील ऑनलाइन has hosted this conversation, कि ये वाली conversation die down कर चुकी है domestic workers के rights की. Somehow हमने क्या किया है, हमने issues को compartmentalize कर.
तो इसके बारे में realize होने के बाद
एक्चुअली हमने कंपार्टमेंटलाइज कर दिए चाइल्ड राइट्स, विमेन राइट्स, ह्यूमन राइट्स. Why don't you understand? It's a vicious cycle. It's a trap because there are 3 axes I can think of right now जिसकी वजह से डोमेस्टिक वर्कर्स के साथ इतनी ज्यादती होती है और जुल्म होते हैं. Number 1, it has to do with gender because majority of domestic workers are women. Secondly, of course, class. There's the class apartheid at play. And let's not forget, religious minorities are the most vulnerable to exploitation, not just within as domestic workers, but also within the domain of bonded labor. या आप लोग खुद ही देख लें, इस पर हम आगे जाकर आएंगे, बट मैं ब्रीफली बात कर दूं कि एक एडवर्टाइजमेंट हम सारों ने देखी थी, and there was a social media outrage, rightly so, कि वो जो sewer cleaning की job है, that was open only to minorities. So many axes and vectors of inequality around which this topic revolves. तो इसमें तो सबसे पहले हम सबको, इधर हम तीनों बैठे हैं, हम अपने आप से जरा ये सवाल पूछे ना कि what is our role? Because we have consciously, unconsciously, we have contributed to this inequality, and all of us are beneficiaries of this system.
I understand domestic workers are a part of it, but I do believe that there are other forms of slavery जो कि हमारी society में बहुत आम और common है और हमें पता भी नहीं है, हम realize भी नहीं करते.
All right. I wouldn't want to take up too much time of my co-panelists, but of course मैं बिल्कुल again summarize कर देता हूँ. When I think of slavery, and it can take so many forms, domestic workers is what we've started with, और अभी तो ये खुद में एक बहुत लंबी conversation है, which I hope that we would be able to cover. And then of course bonded labor, मैंने वो बिल्कुल passing में mention किया है. You could think of people working on the farms. वहाँ भी generation after generation is tied up. They inherit slavery and debt bondage from their parents and from their grandparents for generations. उसी तरह से I can think of domestic servitude जिसमें forced marriages आ जाती हैं, जिसके अंदर human and sex trafficking आ जाती है, and all of this is happening while we are sitting comfortably, leading our lives, sitting in our rooms. I'm glad we're talking about it because that is a beginning, but I hope that we understand the size of the problem at hand. The Punjab Domestic Workers Act 2019 जो कि काफी हद तक कॉपी पेस्ट कर दिया गया है, वो जो डोमेस्टिक वर्कर्स बिल इस्लामाबाद कैपिटल टेरिटरी में भी आ रहा है. बट लेट्स जस्ट, अभी तो इम्प्लीमेंटेशन से पहले लेट्स जस्ट लुक एट इट कि ऑन पेपर should we be satisfied or are we satisfied with the content of the so-called protections that domestic servants servants का तो word use ही नहीं कर सकते, domestic workers have been afforded? Okay, सबसे पहले तो मैं आना चाहता हूँ that domestic workers का जो एक्ट है पंजाब वाला, वो ये कहता है कि सर्वेंट का वर्ड आप यूज नहीं कर सकते. बट फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल I understand the spirit behind this provision, which is कि the way that domestic workers are addressed in derogatory terms, वो इस्तेमाल ना किया जाए. अब इसका जो उर्दू ट्रांसलेशन मेरे माइंड में आता है, बिकॉज हमने से किसी ने नहीं सुना कि हमारे घरों में, हमारे जानने वालों के घरों में कहा जा रहा हो सर्वेंट कम हियर. Servant was never the word that people use. Knocker was the word.
I think mulazim is
they use the word knocker, and they've been using the word knocker with immense hatred. The connotation of the word knocker in our society is ghulam. दरअसल अगर मैं servant की translation करना चाहूं तो उसकी translation गुलाम बनती है मेरी नजरों में, और knocker भी नहीं बनती, the way that it is used in Pakistan. So I would have wished that the act would have named the particular word in Urdu as we use it. The word which is used is knocker. क्या कहते हैं जी इधर, आप क्या सुनते हो, नौकरों को बुलाओ, वो नौकरानी किधर चली गई, पता नहीं है नौकर कहाँ चले जाते हैं। सबसे पहले मुझे फिर बताया जाए कि आप डोमेस्टिक वर्कर्स कहोगे, आप सर्वेंट्स नहीं कहोगे, दिस इज व्हाट द एक्ट सेज, तो क्या अब डू यू एक्सपेक्ट कि हम डिफेंस में या गुलबर्ग में किसी घर में जाएंगे, among the posh people they are going to say, domestic worker can you please tend to this affair, domestic worker can you please hand me a glass of water, they're not going to say that. तो फिर इसका नेमुल बदल उर्दू में क्या होना चाहिए, इज मुलाजिम द अप्रोप्रिएट वर्ड, क्या वर्ड है, बाजी, आया बाजी, chauffeur, what are the words which should be used, so that people who are working for us, जो हमारे घरों में काम करें, they should number one feel respected. So let's not take cosmetic measures कि on the face of it बहुत अच्छा लग रहा है, सबके लिए बहुत अच्छी PR एक्सरसाइज होगी कि look we care so much, no, show it. सेकेंडली, बिल्कुल मैटरनिटी लीव्स की भी इधर बात आई हुई है, उसके ऊपर मैंने
नहीं, हमारी ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस में हम लोगों को, जब हम लोगों को ऑर्गेनाइजेशन में या कॉर्पोरेशन में हायर करते हैं तो वी कॉल देम बाय देयर नेम, और उनको हम साहब,
नहीं, मैम आई वर्क इन एकेडेमिया,
व्हाई इज इट सो
मैम, सर मैम कल्चर चल रहा होता है, so people who are basically and ultimately shouldering the burden of our high-fire lifestyles, they are collapsing under this pressure, and not only collapsing, but the damage that you're doing to their own self-esteem. Do they deserve it? Does anyone deserve it? Secondly, maternity 6 weeks, ILO की अगर designation देखें तो I've heard female activists say 12 weeks. 6 weeks does not even begin to address the concern at hand. But on paper, of course, there can be no, for example, unequal pay between genders or between members of different religions or caste. And of course, इस तरह की provisions हैं पंजाब डोमेस्टिक वर्कर्स एक्ट के अंदर जो कि बहुत ज्यादा प्रोग्रेसिव हैं. बट हम लोगों को इधर बस आराम से बैठ जाना चाहिए, बिकॉज द थिंग इज कि इट्स ट्रीटेड एज लेबर लॉ, बट उसमें बहुत क्रिमिनल लॉ एलिमेंट्स आते हैं. अब the conversation is going to get dark, but it should. And it's going to get dark because last year I remember 7-year-old Zohra Bibi, she was killed, एक बच्ची 7 साल की, she was killed for freeing a bird. 16-year-old. अब यहाँ कहा गया है कि जी anyone who is 15 and above can be employed, with the supposition ये है कि अगर आपकी उम्र 15 से ज्यादा है तो फिर you are not that vulnerable. उस्मा बीबी 16 साल की थी, and her dead body was found in the canal. Or influential, wealthy people, her employers had just, they had disposed of her body in a canal. और उसको जीते जी भी she was tortured and there were torture marks found on her body. तो ये supposition जॉन सी है कि 15 से ऊपर 15 to 18 वाला एज ब्रैकेट जो है, you are safe enough.
There has to be a minimum age requirement for sure. Minimum age requirement होनी चाहिए. After all, you
Child Rights Convention.
एक certain
because 16-year-old child and the 16-year-old is a child according to me. Usma Bibi was a child, and let's recognize it as a case of child abuse. Child abuse because of the class that she belonged to. तो अगर हम उसको उस तरह से recognize करेंगे, the criminal dimension of it should also be brought in. We have, of course, 2016 के बाद पाकिस्तान penal code के अंदर नई provisions आई हैं, जैसे section 328A. That is what comes to mind, cruelty to children. But cruelty to children in a domestic workers context has a completely different twist to it. And that is class apartheid, which I'm talking about. So even on paper, I'm sorry, but there's a lot which has been left to, that a lot needs to be worked upon.
You pretend like you're doing a favor to someone and you want to use that to say, oh, I'm not going to pay the full minimum wage because I'm doing them these supposed favors, when it's actually a favor to you in sense. So I think इसको भी जो है address करना बहुत important है. कानून के अलावा जो attitudes है हमारे middle class और elite की society में towards savior complex आ जाता है 5-10 हज़ार रुपए किसी को मिले.
जो savior complex की इन्होंने बात कही है ना, I'll tell you, this is a very interesting conversation I had with someone from, of course, our social setup, and that person said to me, I treat my servants very well. मैंने तो बहुत अच्छा रखा है. I'm not at all like my दादी, I'm not at all like my mother-in-law. वो तो पता है, वो तो मारती थी रख के. मैं बहुत अच्छा ट्रीट करती हूँ अपने servants को. And I just heard that person praise herself, and then I asked, okay, fine. Should this question not be put to the servant herself or himself? Who is going to determine whether you're treating your servant or your employee well? Is it your servant, in your own words, मेरे ख्याल से उनसे सवाल पूछते हैं ना, नहीं 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 मतलब मैं I treat my servant very well, मुझे नहीं पता, I've seen my mother do this, I've seen my mother-in-law do that, so he savior complex कि अगर हमारे पास ना काम कर रहे होते तो तुम किधर जाते, तुम्हें तो एक वक्त की रोटी भी ना मिल रही होती। तो अगेन व्हेन दिस मेंटेलिटी सेट्स इन, exploitation is bound to occur because मैंने अभी क्या कहा, एक vicious circle है। नंबर वन, अगर एक एम्प्लॉय आता है, इमेजिन कर लो मैं कोई सेठ साहब हूँ, ठीक है ना, मैं बहुत ही कोई नवाब जी हूँ और मेरे पास कोई एम्प्लॉयमेंट लेने आया है, आई एम एन एक्सट्रीमली प्रिविलेज्ड पर्सन। वो इंसान मुझे कहता है कि पंजाब डोमेस्टिक वर्कर्स एक्ट के अंदर मेरे पास राइट है मिनिमम वेज ऑल्दो एक गवर्निंग बॉडी ने सेटअप करनी थी जो अभी तक सेटअप हुई नहीं है, बट वो 20,000 रुपीज है पूरे मुल्क के अंदर। तो वो कहता है कि मुझे अगर मिनिमम वेज नहीं दोगे तो मैं तुम्हारे खिलाफ कंप्लेन करूंगा, whichever forum that is. You know what I'm going to say as a privileged person?
Yeah.
I'm going to say for one person such as you, I've got 10 other lined up because people are living in abject poverty. So those people are I'm going to hire them. They are not going to threaten me with a legal action. दे सकता हूँ कि फिर आप जॉब से जाओ, मैं आपको नहीं हायर करता। तो क्या ये वाला लॉ पंजाब डोमेस्टिक वर्कर्स एक्ट का इस सूरत में कोई लीगल फोरम प्रोवाइड करता है एक ऐसे इंसान को फॉर नॉट बीइंग कंसिडर्ड fairly या unfair dismissal? If my employee tries to assert his legitimate right to the minimum wage and I dismiss that employee on that ground, क्या unfair dismissal की बिना पर वो मेरे खिलाफ केस ला सकता है? ये सवाल होना चाहिए।
आपको लगता है कि उसकी will they be able to hold these people accountable or take action or assist the workers?
I'm just so sorry. Yeah, आप ही के जवाब में I want to add on. So if you look at the Punjab Domestic Workers Act, what are the penalties? 5,000 rupees, 1 month imprisonment. Second offense, 10,000 rupees. So ये कोई amount है for people who are so privileged? ये कोई amount है? Secondly,
I think Islamabad offers 10,000.
10,000.
Islamabad में 10,000
not an improvement.
And
not an improvement.
But the minimum wage was 20,000 rupees, which
again
I thought was
a young boy. His name was Akhtar Hussain. He was killed by the daughter of an MPA. And guess what? That MPA is roaming around freely. She's a teacher. She teaches children. And she's dealing with kids. Why? क्योंकि मुका हो जाते हैं. Why? क्योंकि आप पेमेंट कर देते हो families को. Why? Because if you compare, for example, with the English jurisdiction, वहाँ murder is
that's like a criminal justice issue.
Murder is an offense against the state. It's not a private matter. It's not like tort law. Okay, it's a private affair and you can pay compensation and wriggle your way out of it. No. तो यहाँ ये वाला system है ना, that you pay off. You just pay off the family of the child. I think the state has to intervene and it should be जिस तरह honor killings के अंदर हुआ after the Qandeel Baloch murder, कि you cannot just pay off the family of the victim, but you will have to face the courts, you will have to face the law. ये होना चाहिए। अगर इस तरह की पेनल्टीज आप नहीं इंट्रोड्यूस कर रहे, मैं फिर कह रहा हूं, these are just cosmetic measures। और अभी तो लिटरेसी इतनी नहीं है, डोमेस्टिक वर्कर्स बेचारों को तो पता ही नहीं है कि ऐसा कोई लॉ एग्जिस्ट भी करता है और वो ये अपने राइट्स कैसे इन्फोर्स करें।
मुनीब, हम लोग I think हम 8वें नंबर पे हैं global slavery.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. नहीं तो हमारी कोई international obligations नहीं है.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much that you talking about this. I absolutely agree. जो तैयबा केस भी उसामा ने अभी साइट किया, and just tells that there's a culture of impunity, and that explains why we are in the top 10. हम number 8 पर हैं out of like around I believe more than 160 countries on the global slavery index. And इसके अंदर I think we should all feel ashamed. और वही जो मैंने कहा, ask ourselves the question कि हमने इसमें क्या रोल प्ले किया to bring it on to the 8th slot into the top 10. इंटरनेशनल ऑब्लिगेशंस की जो आपने बात की, एक तो चाइल्ड राइट्स कन्वेंशन में बता दिया है, वो ऑफ कोर्स सिर्फ डोमेस्टिक वर्कर्स से रिलेट नहीं करती, चाइल्ड लेबर से भी करती है। उसका जो फर्स्ट ऑप्शन प्रोटोकॉल है उसमें सेल ऑफ चिल्ड्रन के साथ डील करता है, एंड पाकिस्तान इज द स्टेट पार्टी इवन टू दैट ऑप्शन प्रोटोकॉल। नाउ अ लॉट ऑफ दीज चिल्ड्रन, आप तैयबा कह लो, आप अभी जो मैंने आपको अख्तर का बताया, या आप ये जोरा बच्ची जो थी 7 साल की, एक तो आप ये देखें इनको क्या पे मिलती है, 4-4 हजार रुपए के ऊपर सेल्फ एम्प्लॉय किया जाता है। क्योंकि मैंने अभी कहा है, ये राइट असर्ट करने की कोशिश करेंगे ना अपने 2019 के एक्ट के तहत, तो इनको इनके एम्प्लॉयर्स कह देंगे कि वो है बाहर का दरवाजा। सिर्फ वो प्यार से नहीं कहेंगे, they torture them and they beat them up, and this is very very common in our urban cities.
Every Pakistani is wondering कि ये recently domestic workers को associate किया जाता है as modern slaves. They are labeled as modern slaves. तो उसका आप बताएं कि what's the correlation? Why are you calling these domestic workers slaves when they're paid, they have jobs, वो लोग काम करते हैं, आप उनको slaves क्यों कहना चाह रहे हैं? Anyone?
सबसे पहले तो we have to do a breakdown analysis of what is meant by the word slavery itself. Now, if I were to read it off some book, Anti-Slavery International defines slavery as either way you're forced to work through coercion, it could be mental or physical threat, or you are owned or controlled by an employer, or you are dehumanized, treated as a commodity, or you are physically constrained. So there are various facets and aspects to the word slavery. Unfortunately, what happens is that when the public and private dichotomy that comes into play, that the state is going to regulate and the legal system is going to regulate whatever is in the public domain, it leaves the private domain unregulated, and that is where exploitation could set in. Domestic servitude, domestic slavery, that is what you are exposing domestic workers to. Are they being paid a fair wage? I'm not even at this stage, I'm not even talking about minimum wage. Fair wage according to the value of their work. Secondly, are the hours, the timings of their work regulated at all? Even if in law they are they being practiced? Are they being paid fairly? Are they being treated fairly? Do they have social security benefits? Do they have maternity benefits? Etc. etc. Every single thing which an employee might expect in the public domain, what has been hitherto regulated by, for example, the Punjab Industrial Relations Act 2010, if I were to speak of Punjab. Are those entitlements available to domestic workers or not? That is what the question should be. And when I think of the definition of slavery as I've defined it, and when I look at what happens to domestic workers and I compare the two, unfortunately, the conclusion that I reach is that the definition of slavery that I've just provided, domestic workers in modern day Pakistan completely fit within that. And this is exactly why we need to address it.